down level 2, and I'm so happy to carry on with you in morning prayer today. Let's now turn to the Lord. Kia inoi tātou. E te atua kārawa, e tūwhera ana ngā ngākau katoa ki a koe, e mōhiotia ana ngā hiahia katoa, e kore hoki e ngaro i a koe te mea huna. Whakahange iho tō wairua tapu, hei whakamā i ngā whakaro o mātou ngākau. Kia tino aroha ai mātou ki a koe, kia tika ai te whakanui i tō ingoa tapu, ko ihu karaiti hoki tō matawariki. Āmene. A reading from the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 11 and beginning at verse 1. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. They destroyed the Ammonite army and laid siege to the city of Rabbah. However, David stayed behind in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after having her menstrual period. Then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, "I'm pregnant." Then David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." So Joab sent him to David. When Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing. Then he told Uriah, "Go on home and relax." David even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. When David heard that Uriah had not gone home, he summoned him and asked, "What's the matter? Why didn't you go home last night after being away for so long?" Uriah replied, "The ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab and my master's men are camping in the open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing." "Well, stay here today," David told him, "and tomorrow you may return to the army." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day and the next. Then David invited him to dinner and got him drunk, but even then he couldn't get Uriah to go home to his wife. Again he slept at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. So the next morning David wrote a letter to Joab and gave it to Uriah to deliver. The letter instructed Joab, "Station Uriah on the front lines where the battle is fiercest, then pull back so that he will be killed." So Joab assigned Uriah to a spot close to the city wall where he knew the enemy's strongest men were fighting. And when the enemy soldiers came out of the city to fight, Uriah the Hittite was killed along with several other Israelite soldiers. Then Joab sent a battle report to David. He told his messenger, "Report all the news of the battle to the king." But he might get angry and ask, "Why did the troops go so close to the city? Didn't they know there would be shooting from the walls? Wasn't Abimelech, son of Gideon, killed at Thebez by a woman who threw a millstone down on him from the wall? Why would you get so close to the wall?" Then tell him, "Uriah the Hittite was killed too." So the messenger went to Jerusalem and gave a complete report to David. "The enemy came out against us in the open fields," he said, "and as we chased them back to the city gate, the archers on the wall shot arrows at us. Some of the king's men were killed, including Uriah the Hittite." "Oh well, tell Joab not to be discouraged," David said. "The sword devours this one today and that one tomorrow. Fight harder next time and conquer the city." When Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. When the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives. Then she gave birth to a son. But the Lord was displeased with what David had done. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God. Well, this is a bit of a sordid tale, and one of the striking things about the scriptures is that God has never shied away from showing us the weaknesses of the people who are part of his plan. It comes as no surprise to him, and it ought to come as no surprise to us to find that even in the midst of God's own people, there are those who do very great wrong. We're not supposed to celebrate it, we are supposed to mourn it, to grieve over it, and to oppose it, but we should not be surprised. This story is told in a way that we recognize a couple of really important things. One of them is that the person who is doing the wrong here is David. David is very active, not in fighting the Lord's battles, or even in being in God's presence. The Ark of the Covenant has gone away, God's presence has gone off with God's people. The king has stayed back and is really resting, but he's very active in the kinds of things he does. He sends, he commands, he sleeps, he murders. David is very, very active in this. Sometimes, of course, that's a challenge for us, that we can have misdirected activity towards evil. But there's something else we need to notice here, and it's actually a question that we ask in our own culture, and a very recognisable question in the culture of the day. That question is, no hea koe? Where do you come from? That's a very introductory and important question. No Kaikoura aho? I come from Kaikoura. Uriah would have said, I come from the land of Heti. Heti. He's a Hittite. He's actually not an Israelite at all. David would have proudly said, I'm from Israel. And yet he shows himself not to be a true Israelite, not really one of God's people in this chapter. And Uriah, this foreigner, shows himself to be really one of God's people. And in the midst of this dark tale, we see that God's promise to Abraham to be a blessing to all the peoples of the world is starting to bring in people from outside. But David, instead of recognizing the beauty of God's promise, commits evil not just against Bathsheba, not just against Uriah, but against the very pattern of what God is doing through Israel. David's sin here is held up not just as a personal moral example to us, but as one that warns us that as God's goodness starts to be extended to people who are outside our own cultural group and setting, the risk is that we harm it by our own sinfulness, because we conceive of God's blessing being poured out for us as an ethnic. David's in the middle of this actual war against other people, and he can't see that God is doing something greater here. So God is, perhaps in some ways, David thinks anyway, is a little bit absent from this whole story. And here's the last thing I want to say this morning about this. In the story, David is the active one. He's doing everything. He's sending people here and there. He's listening, he's committing adultery, and he's committing murder. But right at the very end, the narrator of the story wants us to understand that even though God appears to not be present, he is in fact present. Even though the symbol of God's presence, the ark, has gone away, the Lord still watches. This is what Dale Ralph Davis says. The way the narrative is written then tells us that the silence of God does not indicate the absence of God. Psalm 11 says that his eyes gaze upon, his eyelids test the sons of men. Because evil runs on in its successful course does not mean that God is not watching it. And yet there's the mystery and there's the problem that many of us may feel with 2 Samuel 11. Like a great deal of injustice, the evil of 2 Samuel 11 goes on unimpeded, as if God is not there. But we are told at last that it was evil in Yahweh's eyes. If Yahweh hates injustice, why did he not prevent it? If he hates oppression, why did he not stop it? To steal the mourner's words at Lazarus' grave, could not this God have kept Uriah from dying and Bathsheba from being oppressed? Our story does not resolve this mystery. It only insists on a clarity. Yahweh may be silent, but he is not sightless. The thing David had done was evil in Yahweh's eyes. David may have taken Bathsheba's body and Uriah's blood, but he will have to face Yahweh's eyes. Now we're going to hear more about that tomorrow on Tuesday in our morning prayer then. But for the moment, I just want you to ponder this, that the same question we have in coming to 2 Samuel 11 is the question that the mourners at Lazarus' grave had. Could you not have stopped this? Our question does rise up to God when we see evil, injustice and oppression. Could you not have stopped this? But as we ask that question, I want to encourage you to hear the promise and the warning of that last verse. God may seem to be silent, but he is not actually absent from this picture. And in this story we hear the hint of God's judgment against evil and an end to it coming. In the story of Lazarus, we see the promise that God is not only going to stop evil, even death itself, but he's going to redeem us from all the consequences. He's going to bring us back from all the harm that has come about from evil being unchecked. We don't have an answer to why God doesn't stop it, but we do have the promise of hope that God will do something about it. He'll bring an end to evil, and he will, in the long run, bring about life to all those who have been wounded and harmed by evil, even evil that thinks that it will go unjudged, like David's here. I runga i te ingoa o te matua te tama me te wairua tapu. Āmine. Ko ākono nei tātou e tō tātou ariki, ka inoi tātou. E tō mātou matua i te rangi, kia tapu tau ingoa, kia tai mai tau rangatiratanga. Kia mea tia tāu e pai ai ki runga ki te whenua, kia areta anō ki tō te rangi. Hoa mai kia mātou ai nei, he taro mā mātou mō tia nei rā. Murua o mātou hara, me mātou hoki e muru nei o te hunga i harana kia mātou. Aua hoki mātou e kawea kia whakawaia, i ngāri whakaorangia mātou i te kino. Nō hoki te rangatiratanga, te kaha me te kororia. Ake, ake ake, Āmine. And we say together the grace. Kia tau kia tātou katoa, te atawhai o tō tātou ariki o ihi karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, ake ake, Āmine.